Hello, and welcome to something a little different this week. I've been getting a few questions on what kind of equipment and tools that I use, and I figured I'd put together this top 5 list of the most essential things that I think you need, either beginning this hobby or you're looking to upgrade some of the equipment that you already have. I've left links to all of these products down in the description below, so feel free to check them out. And just a heads up, some of the links below are affiliate links, which will help out the channel. So thank you for your support, and let's get into it. Okay, so first up, we're talking about brushes. These are the current brushes I'm using. I cycle through brushes depending on the level of wear, but for right now, this is my kind of go-to selection. So I've got some cheap dry brushes here. These are actually makeup brushes. You can get these on Amazon, and they're just a very cheap kit that you can buy, and you can trim these down as well if you don't like how long these are. But they're great for big surface areas and dry brushing. These are some official miniature painting brushes here. So this is a dry brush from Game Master. I think I got this in a set with some paints and basing materials, and they're okay. But if you want to save some money, you can go for some cheaper style brushes. I have these because they're just different shapes. This one has kind of a chisel tip, and the other one is a flat. You can see that this was a army painter brush. You have to be careful when you're leaving brushes in water for a long time because it will erode the paint on the handle. But that brings me to my main brushes. These are the Rosemary & Co. Kolinsky Sable Series 33. I love these brushes, they're fantastic. The Kolinsky part refers to the type of brushes, so rather than synthetic, these are actually made from Kolinsky sable hair, which is a type of ferret in Siberia. But because of that, I do find these brushes are a little bit more expensive than your usual brush. But here are some of the benefits. After painting with these a long time, I do find that they retain their shape quite easily. They can spring right back into that initial shape with just a little bit of water. They also are quite springy as well, so I find that synthetic brushes don't have as much give to the bristles, whereas these ones will actually bend and conform to the contours of the model, which is super handy for rounded edges and things like that. I use 2 sizes of this brush. I use the size 2 and the size 2.0, and you can kind of see the difference here. Basically, the longer the bristles, the more paint the brush can hold before you need to refill it or clean it again. So I actually prefer the longer of the 2 brushes, and I find that once the paintbrush is fully loaded up, I can normally paint something for a very long time before I need to even reload it with the next batch of paint. But if you're just looking to start out, a normal hobby brush that you can find in a local game store is just as good as any. But if you're looking to upgrade that experience, I would highly recommend a Kolinsky Sable bristle brush. Now, it can be quite tempting to get brushes like this one, for example, which has very few bristles on the end and is meant for fine detail. But I will warn you that really it does come down to the fineness of the tip when you're looking for high detail pieces. So if you're dotting eyes or painting on eyebrows and lips and things, look for a brush that has a decent tip on the end of it, compared to this one, for example, which you can kind of see is already fraying. You'll get much more detail and fidelity out of a brush that's well kept. I also found this pack of Kolinsky Sable style brushes on Amazon. I'm not sure how authentic they are. I've tried them a couple times, they work just as well. You can see they've got that kind of springiness to them. The Rosemary & Co. brand is a UK brand, and they can be quite difficult to get overseas. And because I'm now based in the US, I find that finding these brushes can be a great alternative. Lastly, if you're looking to take care of your brushes, I would recommend a shampoo or conditioner specifically designed for cleaning brushes. I've got 2 types here. I started using the pink soap, and it was okay, but I really like this Masters cleaning soap here. Every 2 or 3 painting sessions, I'll make sure that I clean the brushes with this conditioner, and it just helps preserve them and gets some of the gunk out of those bristles. I will say as well, try to avoid paint in the ferrule of the brush, which is the metal section of the brush. If you get paint in there and it dries, it will lead to the bristles fraying outwards, and that will just ruin the tip on the brush. Next up, we're talking about lighting, and this is really important for any kind of hobby where you're close up and you're going to be using your eyes a lot, squinting and things like that. So I've got this angle pose lamp, and you're able to switch it between the different light spectrums. I really like the blue cold light for working, and this is a great cheap lamp with really nice LEDs in it. It's got like kind of a ring light and a magnifying glass in there. You can kind of see that the magnifier is really good for close up. I wouldn't rely on it too much for painting because it will throw off your depth perception, but for like just checking face details or small details like the buttons on Luke's chest here, like it's great for that. I also don't rely on just one light source. I've got 2 or 3 lamps dotted around the desk and an overhead light as well. This is just a generic work light that you can find in a hardware store, for example. But again, lighting super important for close-up work and concentration. Next up, we have storage. I recently picked up these Jikoshi cases. I absolutely love them. I didn't think I'd fall in love with them. I've always used like foam cases, like the Apache cases that you can pluck the foam out of and stuff like that. But you can see these Jikoshi cases work fantastic for awkward size miniatures, big miniatures, armies. They're great for kill teams and skirmish miniatures that you just need a tray. It comes with these metal oven tray things, and if you've magnetized your bottom of the bases, they will stick to them perfectly. The case itself has a handle on the top, so it's great for taking to tournaments. It's quite secure and quite sturdy feeling. And so this case is great for storing miniatures or moving them on the go. I used to keep my paints on my desk, and I ended up just losing a lot of space to work because I was acquiring more and more for each different project. So I recently found these shelving units on Amazon. These are meant for nail polishes or essential oils, but they come with these little holders that will fit the Army Painter paints perfectly. And you can remove the holders, and you can also fit the Citadel paints as well. Not only is it a great way to get things off the desk, but also you can see at a glance your whole range of paints that you have available. I've got one of these MDF holders for paints. It's okay, it's a little unstable. I did glue it as well, but I wouldn't rely on this as a good way of storing your paints. They're quite difficult to see, and if you knock it accidentally, they'll all come tumbling out. Next on your list of essentials should be a wet palette. For years, I was using a dry palette like the one on the left here, just for something to mix paints on. I wasn't really considering what those paints were doing or whether they needed to be watered down or anything like that. But as soon as I got a wet palette, that changed. This is the Army Painter wet palette. I love this thing. It's small. You can get it in 2 different sizes. The top tray is great for storing brushes. And then underneath, you get a sponge and some parchment paper. And you can kind of see, you got to be careful because the paint will leak through and stain the sponge, but they do give you a spare in the box. So what you do is you take a sheet of parchment paper every time you want to sit down and paint, and you place this on a damp sponge. And then what this allows you to do is mix your paints on the paper, and it'll actually thin them just a little bit as well because the water underneath is soaking through. It gives you a wet surface to mix your paints on rather than a dry one. However, there is a reason why I have both still. Here I've got a selection of paints. These are all different types of paints. We've got speed paints, washes, and regular paints. So this is just an Army Painter acrylic paint, and you can see with just a little bit of water on the brush, I can thin this right the way down and get the consistency I'm looking for to apply it to the miniature. And right here you can see this Citadel paint is a little thicker than it should be. I think it's a little older. And so even just putting a little dab of this on here without any kind of medium or anything to thin this down, you can see that the wet palette is working its magic and just creating a nice thinned version of this paint. It's also great for blending the colors together as well, and I'm able to get a shade in between these two colors without adding any extra paint to the palette. It's just letting the moisture of the wet palette mix between the two colors. I find Pro Acryl's paints a little on the thin side, and you can see here that it does retain the consistency of the paint without letting it spill out over the whole paper. And again, without adding any water or anything like that, you can see how much I can thin it down just using the surface. So that's when I would use a wet palette, is for instances like this, just normal acrylic paints that need a little bit of thinning, or if I'm using just colors to mix. When I would use a dry palette is for things like shades, which is a wash. This is going to be a thinner consistency, and this is great for just putting in this inkwell here without having it spill all over the palette. If you put it on the wet palette, it will sink straight through that parchment paper and stain the sponge underneath. Also, the water from the wet palette will thin this right the way down as well. And sometimes you may want that, but in most cases, I like to use the wash almost straight out of the bottle. The same goes for the speed paints. These will go straight through that parchment paper if you're not careful. So whenever you're using speed paints or contrast paints, I always use them on the dry palette. I'll also have an extra well with just the medium, just so I can thin these down without having to mess with the consistency. You can see I'm putting it on the wet palette here, but you can also kind of see that just with a little bit of water, it's already kind of ruined that consistency. Lastly, I always use metallics on a dry palette. I've put them on wet palettes before and they just kind of separate and go a bit weird and funky. Again, it's something to do with the makeup and the medium that they use in them. As soon as you add water to them, you can kind of see that they do separate into two different types of paint. So whenever I'm using metallics, I always try to stick to the dry palette. Lastly, the bonus of the wet palette is you can actually close it back up again, and it will keep your paints fresh and ready to use for about 6 hours or so. And so you can actually pause between sessions and come back. The last essential item I would recommend is a paint handle. I've got a few paint handles here that I use. These are just caps from sports drinks that I've applied this blue tack to, and it's great for just holding miniatures in place. You could also use a block of wood or something, some kind of handle that you've made, just for either priming miniatures, or if it's comfortable enough, you can actually paint with them as well. What I like about this method is that it's cheap and effective, and it gets your hands off of the model while you're priming and painting. Next, we have these Citadel handles, and these are kind of expensive, but they're really nice. They've got like an ergonomic design to them, and they're spring-loaded, so you can put these miniatures in there. They come in two different sizes. You can get the smaller handle or the larger handle for bigger models and bigger bases. But they got these little claws that you can kind of dig into the side of your model. You can see that this handle fits this clan rack really comfortably and is accessible from any angle. It's also got this nice bottleneck design, so you can almost just spin the model with your fingertips and get all around it without having to cramp your hand up. And a quick tip on painting posture: if you put both your hands or wrists on the table, you get much more of a steady grip than if you were to paint almost free floating. The small handle goes right the way up to a Shatterpoint size base, although it is really tight and it will scratch the rim of the base as well. So that's just down to your own preference. If that's what you're painting most of the time, that's the biggest size this will go. But if you use the bigger handle, it's a little bit of overkill, but you can actually fit much bigger bases in there comfortably. It depends on what you're painting. It is a heavier handle as well, so just be prepared when you're doing this for longer painting sessions. And you can see as well, this handle goes up to an insane size of base. This is Usharam. This could be a sneak peek of a model coming up in the future. And it is awesome, but also really weird and unwieldy to paint on something like this. So there you have it, 5 essential tools for starting out in this hobby, or if you're already a beginner and you're looking to upgrade your existing tools, these are great recommendations and for the most part fairly inexpensive. I've left a link down below to any of the products I've already mentioned in this video. And if you found this content really helpful, let me know down in the comments. I've got a lot more recommendations and more products I can recommend. Feel free to like the video. I always really appreciate that. That helps me out. If you have experience with any of these, let me know down in the comments below. And if you have recommendations as well, let me know. And if you've really enjoyed this and you want to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel. I do videos, painting tutorials and things like that every week. Good luck with the hobbying, everyone, and thank you so much for watching.